Hey guys, today I'm going to be playing some good old Vampire Survivors. Now, I don't know if you know this game, but it came out a few years ago. It's a roguelike, super popular, and it's a super good game. Just got the DLC Legacy of the Moonspell. I want to play through it all today. So yeah, that's what's going to be happening here. I'm also going to be reading to you some stories about the most evil children who murder their own families. So yeah, you can just sit back, relax, watch me play this new DLC, or perhaps you can do something else, play the video in the background, try and fall asleep, whatever. Just make sure you're comfortable, and let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about a case that has been debated for decades. A case so strange and emotionally complicated that people still argue about it long after the crime itself. Some see it as a cold blooded murder motivated by greed. Others see it as the tragic outcome of years of fear, trauma, and desperation. Either way, what happened inside a wealthy Beverly Hills mansion on a summer night in 1989 would become one of the most famous criminal cases in American history. Before the headlines, before the courtroom battles, and before television turned the story into a national obsession, there was a family that seemed to have everything: money, status, success. To outsiders, the Mendez family appeared to be living the American dream. Jose Mendez was a highly successful executive who had built an impressive career and accumulated enormous wealth. His wife, Kitty, lived a life that many people would envy. Their sons, Lyle and Eric, grew up surrounded by opportunities that most teenagers could only imagine. From the outside, it looked like a family destined for success. Yet, as investigators would eventually learn, appearances can hide realities that few people suspect. Families often present one image to the world and live a very different reality behind closed doors. In August of 1989, that reality exploded into public view. On the evening of August 20th, Jose and Kitty spent what seemed like a completely ordinary night inside their Beverly Hills home. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would be their last. They were relaxing together, unaware that events were about to unfold that would shock the nation. Sometime later, gunfire shattered the silence. The attack was brutal. It was sudden, and by the time it was over, both parents were dead. When authorities arrived and began examining the scene, they immediately recognized the violence involved. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was not an accident. Whoever committed the crime had acted with extraordinary force. Detectives began asking the same question investigators always ask in early hours of homicide case. Who would want these two people dead? At first, attention focused outward. Jose's business career had exposed him to countless professional relationships. Detectives explored the possibility that the murders were connected to business disputes, enemies, or organized crime. The sheer brutality of the attack made some investigators wonder whether they were dealing with experienced criminals. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric appeared devastated by the loss of their parents. In public, they seemed like grieving sons trying to process an unimaginable tragedy. Friends and relatives expressed sympathy. The community struggled to understand who could have committed such a violent crime. For a brief period, investigators searched in multiple directions. Yet, as weeks passed, something began drawing attention. The brothers' behavior after the murders started raising questions. Detectives noticed spending patterns that seemed unusual for people supposedly overwhelmed by grief. Large purchases were made, expensive items were bought, luxury lifestyles continued. On their own, these observations proved nothing. People react to trauma in different ways, but experienced investigators understand that behavior after a crime can sometimes reveal important clues. As authorities dug deeper, they discovered that the brothers stood to inherit a substantial fortune. Suddenly, motive entered the picture. Detectives began wondering whether the murders might be connected to money. The possibility transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be an attack by an unknown outsider slowly began appearing to be an attack by turning inward toward the family itself. The pressure increased as investigators examined financial records, interviews, timelines, and witness statements. Then another development changed everything. Individuals connected to the brothers began providing information that raised even more concerns. Conversations that seemed insignificant at first suddenly became important. Statements made before and after the murders were re examined. Detectives started questioning whether the people they had originally viewed as victims might actually be suspects. The idea seemed shocking. After all, few crimes are more difficult for people to comprehend than children killing their own parents. Yet, investigators could not ignore the evidence emerging in front of them. The more they looked, the more the focus narrowed toward Lyle and Eric. Months passed. Public curiosity grew. Media attention intensified. And behind the scenes, detectives continued building a case. Eventually, they reached a conclusion that would send shockwaves through the country. The investigation was no longer centered on finding an outside killer. Authorities believed the killers had been inside the family all along. But while that conclusion answered one question, it opened a much bigger one. If the brothers truly committed the murders, why would they do it? Was it simply about the money, as prosecutors would later claim, or was there a deeper story hidden behind the walls of the Mendez home? A story that would transform the case from a straightforward double homicide into one of the most controversial criminal trials America had ever seen. And as investigators moved closer to the truth, they were about to uncover allegations so explosive that they would divide public opinion for decades to come. As investigators continued building their case, the focus increasingly shifted away from the crime scene itself and toward the relationship between the Mendez family members. By this point, authorities believed they knew who committed the murders. The larger question was why? Prosecutors developed a theory that seemed straightforward. According to their argument, Lyle and Eric wanted to access their parents' wealth. The brothers stood to inherit millions of dollars, and prosecutors believed financial gain provided the motive behind the killings. On the surface, the theory made sense. Detectives had already documented significant spending after the murders. Expensive purchases, luxury items, travel, and lavish lifestyles all became part of the prosecution's narrative. To investigators, it looked as though the brothers were enjoying access to the money that would not have been available to them while their parents were alive. Yet, as the case moved closer to trial, a completely different story began emerging. It was a story that would transform public perception and make the case one of the most controversial in American legal history. The brothers eventually admitted they had killed their parents. That confession changed everything. The central issue was no longer whether they were responsible. The issue became understanding the circumstances that led to the murders. According to Lyle and Eric, the public image of the Mendez family was a lie. Behind the wealth, success, and privilege, they claimed there had been years of fear, control, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. The allegations were explosive. Suddenly, the case was no longer simply about the money. It became a battle between two competing versions of reality. The prosecutors argued that the abuse claims were fabricated after the fact to justify murder and avoid severe punishment. The defense argued that the killings were the tragic result of years of trauma that outsiders never saw. When the trial began, the nation became captivated. Millions of people followed every development. Unlike most criminal cases, this one felt deeply personal to many viewers because it forced people to wrestle with difficult questions. Can victims of long-term abuse eventually reach a breaking point? How does trauma affect decision-making? And perhaps most importantly, how can anyone know what truly happens inside a family when outsiders only see a carefully controlled image? During testimony, jurors heard all allegations that shocked the courtroom. The defense presented evidence intended to show a pattern of abusive behavior inside the household. Witnesses described family dynamics that contrasted sharply with the successful image the Mendez family projected publicly. Friends, relatives, and experts were called to testify. Some supported elements of the brothers' claims. Others challenged them. The courtroom became a battlefield between two narratives. One portrayed the brothers as calculated killers motivated by money. The others portrayed them as young men who had lived for years in an environment dominated by fear. As the trial progressed, public opinion became deeply divided. Some people believed the brothers completely. Others viewed the abuse allegations with skepticism. Many found themselves uncertain. The evidence was complex. The emotions were intense. Unlike many criminal trials where the facts point clearly in one direction, this case left people debating not only what happened, but how those events should be interpreted. Even experienced legal analysts struggled to predict how the jury would respond. The more testimony jurors heard, the more complicated the case became. Every answer seemed to create new questions. Every witness introduced additional uncertainty. And by the time both sides finished presenting their arguments, it was clear that the verdict would be about far more than a simple determination of guilt. It would represent a judgment on which version of the family story the jury believed. Yet, even after months of testimony, dramatic revelations, and non-stop media attention, the legal battle was far from over. because the outcome of the first trial would leave the country without a clear resolution and ensure that the Mendez case remained one of the most talked about criminal investigations in America for years to come. The trial ended in a way that surprised many observers. Despite months of testimony and enormous public attention, jurors were unable to reach an unanimous verdict. The result reflected the uncertainty that had surrounded the case from the beginning. Some jurors appeared persuaded by the prosecution's argument that greed and inheritance motivated the murders. Others were more convinced by the defense's portrayal of long term abuse and psychological trauma. Because the jury could not agree, the case remained unresolved. For the Mendez brothers, it meant another trial. For prosecutors, it meant another opportunity to secure convictions. And for the public, it meant the debate would continue. By the time the second trial began, the country was already deeply familiar with the story. Television coverage, newspaper articles, and endless public discussions had transformed the case into a cultural phenomenon. Yet the second trial unfolded differently. Certain evidence that had played a major role during the first proceedings received less attention. The focus shifted. Prosecutors concentrated heavily on planning, motive, and the deliberate nature of the killings. They argued that regardless of family problems, the murders were calculated acts carried out for financial gain. The defense continued emphasizing abuse and trauma, but the overall tone of the trial was noticeably different. Eventually, jurors reached a verdict. Lyle and Eric Mendez were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For prosecutors, the verdict represented justice for Jose and Kitty Mendez. For supporters of the brothers, it represented a failure to fully understand the effects of long-term abuse. The controversy did not end with the convictions. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Decades later, the case remains one of the most debated criminal cases in American history. New generations continue discovering the story and reaching different conclusions. Some people focus primarily on the brutality of the murders and the evidence suggesting financial motives. Others focus the allegations of abuse and psychological impact such experiences can have over time. What makes the case so enduring is that its resistance simple explanations. Most famous crimes eventually settle into a clear public narrative. The Mendez case never really did. Even today, people continue arguing about whether the brothers were primarily motivated by greed, fear, trauma, or some combination of all three. The case has resurfaced repeatedly through documentaries, books, interviews, and renewed legal efforts. Every resurgence brings fresh debate and fresh examination of evidence that has been discussed far more than 3 decades. Few criminal cases remain this relevant for so long, yet the Mendez story continues capturing attention because it forces people to confront uncomfortable questions about family, abuse, wealth, violence, and justice. It reminds us that the most famous criminal cases are often the ones where certainty remains elusive. And while the Mendez case centered on a wealthy family hiding secrets behind closed doors, the next story would take us into an entirely different world. There would be no Beverly Hills mansion, no multi-million-dollar inheritance, and no years-long courtroom spectacle. Instead, the next case would begin with a disappearance so mysterious and so unsettling that investigators would spend years trying to determine whether they were dealing with an accident, a crime, or something far more complicated than anyone initially imagined. The Mendez case remained controversial because even after investigators identified the killers, people continued arguing about motive and responsibility. The next case would be different. Here, investigators weren't trying to understand why a crime happened. At first, they weren't even sure whether a crime had happened at all. The story begins with a disappearance, one that seemed confusing from the very first day and would eventually become one of the most discussed missing person cases in modern America. Cases involving disappearances often follow a familiar pattern. Some vanishes. Some family members report them missing. Investigators search for clues. Eventually, evidence points in one direction or another. But every so often, a case emerges where almost every answer creates new questions. The disappearance of Maura Murray became one of those cases. Years later, people still debate what happened during the final hours before she vanished. Some believe she met with foul play. Others believe she intentionally disappeared. Still, others think the truth lies somewhere in between. What makes the case so compelling is that despite years of investigation, nobody has been able to provide exactly what happened after one seemingly ordinary night changed everything. Before her disappearance, Maura appeared to be living a life that, from the outside, looked relatively normal. She was a college student with goals, responsibilities, relationships, and plans for the future. Like many young adults, she was navigating the challenges that come with balancing academics, personal life, and uncertainty about what comes next. Friends and family knew her as an intelligent and capable young woman. Yet, in the days leading up to her disappearance, investigators would later discover several events that seemed unusual. At the time, none of them appeared significant enough to predict what was coming. Looking back, however, they became central pieces of the mystery. In the period before she vanished, Maura experienced a series of stressful situations. Some involved school, others involved personal matters. Individually, they may not have seemed extraordinary. People face stress every day. Students struggle with deadlines, relationships, finances, and uncertainty. Yet, investigators would eventually spend years analyzing these events because they were among the few clues available. One of the most frustrating aspects of missing person cases is that investigators often have to work with incomplete information. Unlike a homicide scene, there is no obvious crime. Like a robbery, there is no clear sequence of events. Detectives must reconstruct a person's final known actions and hope that somewhere within the timeline lies the answer. In Maura's case, the timeline became one of the most scrutinized in missing person history. On the day she disappeared, Maura made a series of decisions that investigators would later analyze repeatedly. She packed belongings. She gathered items she apparently intended to take with her. She made arrangements suggesting she planned to be away for a period of time. Yet she did not clearly explain her destination to the people around her. This immediately created uncertainty. Was she taking a brief trip? Was she trying to get away from stress? Was she meeting someone? Investigators couldn't answer those questions with certainty. As the day progressed, Maura drove away from the area where she lived. At some point, her vehicle was traveling through a rural section of New Hampshire. The roads were quiet. The area was isolated. Winter conditions made the environment even more challenging. Then came the event that would become the last confirmed sighting connected to the case. Her vehicle was involved in an accident. It wasn't a catastrophic crash, but it was serious enough to attract attention. Nearby residents became aware that something had happened. One witness later reported seeing a young woman near the vehicle. Another attempted to offer assistance. According to accounts gathered by investigators, Maura declined help. This detail would become incredibly important because it represented one of the final known interactions before she vanished. The timeline that followed is what transformed the case into a mystery. Authorities know approximately when the accident occurred. They know when witnesses observed the scene. They know when emergency responders were notified. What they cannot explain is what happened in the short window between those events. By the time law enforcement arrived, Maura was gone. Her car remained. She did not. That single fact launched one of the largest missing person investigations in the region's history. Search teams flooded the area. Officers examined nearby roads, woods, and properties. Volunteers joined the effort. Investigators initially believed they would locate her quickly. After all, how far could someone travel after a roadside accident in winter conditions? Yet, as hours turned into days, the days turned into weeks, Maura remained missing. No clear trail emerged. No definitive evidence pointed investigators toward a specific explanation. The absence of evidence became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. If she wandered into the wilderness where she was the evidence, if someone picked her up, who was it? If foul play occurred, where did it happen? Every theory contained strengths and weaknesses. And as investigators dug deeper into Maura's life, searching for answers, they would uncover details that made the mystery even more complicated. Instead of narrowing the possibilities, new information seemed to multiply them. The case was becoming less clear, not more, and the public interest grew. Investigators found themselves confronting a disappearance that refused to fit neatly into any familiar category. The young woman who vanished after a seemingly minor roadside accident had left behind a mystery that would endure for decades. And the deeper authorities looked, the harder it became to determine where the truth actually lay. The disappearance of Maura Murray became one of those rare mysteries where every theory seemed possible and every explanation seemed incomplete. Years passed. Investigators came and went. Countless people offered opinions, and yet the central question remained unanswered. What happened to Maura after she walked away from that crashed vehicle? The next case we're looking at is different in almost every way. Here, investigators wouldn't spend years wondering whether a crime had occurred. They knew almost immediately that something terrible had happened. The challenge was understanding how a teenager could commit an act so shocking that it would leave an entire community struggling to comprehend it. This is the story of Sarah Johnson, a case that began with a crime scene so devastating that investigators initially considered multiple possibilities before uncovering a truth that nobody wanted to believe. In September of 2003, the quiet community of Bellevue, Idaho, was shaken by a double homicide that immediately attracted attention. Alan and Diane Johnson were found dead inside their home. From the very beginning, investigators understood they were dealing with a violent crime. The scene itself suggested that whoever committed the murders either knew the victims personally or had a very specific reason for targeting them. Unlike many investigations that began with uncertainty about whether foul play occurred, this case started with one undeniable fact. Two people had been killed inside their own home. Detectives arrived and began the process that follows every major homicide investigation. They secured the scene, collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and started building a timeline. In the earliest hours, the list of possibilities was broad. This was a robbery, the targeted attack, a dispute involving someone outside the family. Investigators couldn't afford to focus too quickly on any single theory. They needed facts. They needed evidence. And most importantly, they needed to understand who had access to the victims during the critical hours before their deaths. As detectives examined the scene, they found themselves paying close attention to something that often becomes important in homicide cases: signs of forced entry. In many situations, evidence of a break-in helps establish whether an unknown intruder may have been involved. But the absence of such evidence can point investigators in a different direction. The Johnson home began raising exactly those kinds of questions. The deeper detectives looked, the more they considered the possibility that the person responsible may not have been a stranger at all. Meanwhile, attention naturally turned toward family members and people closest to the victims. This is standard procedure in homicide investigations. Statistically, victims often know the people who harmed them. Investigators interviewed relatives, friends, neighbors, classmates, and anyone who might possess useful information. During these interviews, one name inevitably received significant attention: Sarah Johnson, the teenage daughter of the victims. At first, there was no reason to assume she was involved. Like anyone who loses family members in a tragedy, she was someone detectives needed to speak with in order to establish facts and timelines. Yet, as investigators continued gathering evidence, they began noticing details that troubled them. Certain statements raised questions. Certain timelines seemed difficult to reconcile. Certain pieces of physical evidence appeared increasingly important. Experienced detectives often describe investigations as puzzles. In the beginning, most of the pieces appeared disconnected. Gradually, however, patterns emerge. That's what was happening here. Investigators weren't relying on a confession. They weren't relying on a single witness. Instead, they were following evidence wherever it led. And increasingly, that evidence seemed to be pointing in a direction few people expected. As the investigation expanded, detectives also examined relationships inside the Johnson family. They wanted to understand the household dynamic. Were there conflicts? Were there ongoing disputes? Had tensions existed before the murders? These questions became critical because investigators believed understanding the family could help explain the crime. What they uncovered painted a more complicated picture than many outsiders realized. Beneath the appearance of a successful family, there were disagreements and concerns that detectives believed could be relevant. One issue in particular began attracting significant attention. Investigators learned about a relationship involving Sarah that might not seem unusual. Parents and teenagers disagree about relationships all the time. Yet detectives became interested in whether those disagreements had escalated beyond ordinary family conflict. As they dug deeper, they discovered information suggesting tensions within the household may have been far more serious than outsiders understood. The possibility immediately changed how investigators viewed the case. If family conflict played a role, then the murders might not have been the result of an outside threat at all. they might have organized from the inside the family itself. That realization transformed the investigation. Detectives intensified their efforts, carefully examining every piece of evidence. They reviewed forensic findings, analyzed witness statements, and reconstructed the final hours before the murders. The more they learned, the more convinced they became that this was not a random act of violence. Someone had a motive, someone had opportunity. And according to investigators, the evidence was gradually identifying exactly who that person was. What began as a double homicide investigation was evolving into something even more shocking. A case that would force an entire community to confront the possibility that the person responsible for the murders might have been far closer to the victims than anyone initially imagined. And as detectives moved closer to proving their theory, they were about to uncover evidence that would place Sarah Johnson at the center of one of the most controversial and unforgettable criminal cases in Idaho history. As investigators continued building their case, the focus increasingly shifted toward the evidence connecting Sarah Johnson to the crime scene. In many homicide investigations, detectives search for a single breakthrough, a confession, a witness, or a piece of forensic evidence that changes everything. In this case, however, the investigation moved forward through a collection of details that, when viewed together, began forming a much larger picture. Detectives carefully examined Sarah's statements about the night of the murders. Like every witness in a major investigation, her account was compared against physical evidence, timelines, and testimony from other individuals. The goal wasn't to prove guilt. The goal was to determine whether the story matched the facts. As investigators worked through the evidence, they began identifying inconsistencies that raised concerns. Certain explanations seemed difficult to reconcile with what detectives were finding at the scene. Certain details appeared to change over time. Individually, these issues might not have meant much. Collectively, they became harder to ignore. Meanwhile, investigators continued exploring the family dynamics that existed before the murders. They learned more about the disagreements involving Sarah's relationship and her parents' objections. Witnesses described tensions that had reportedly intensified in the months leading up to the crime. Detectives became increasingly interested in whether those conflicts provided a motive. As they reconstructed the timeline, they concluded that understanding what was happening inside the household before the murders was essential to understanding the murders themselves. This wasn't simply a question of who committed the crime. It was also a question of why. Prosecutors would later argue that the motive centered on Sarah's desire to continue a relationship that her parents strongly opposed. According to that theory, this conflict had reached a point where Sarah viewed her parents as obstacles standing in the way of the future she wanted. It was a theory that shocked many people. The idea that a teenager could respond to family conflict with such extreme violence was difficult for the community to accept. Yet investigators believed the evidence pointed in that direction. As the case moved closer to trial, forensic evidence became increasingly important. Detectives and prosecutors spent enormous amounts of time analyzing physical evidence recovered during the investigation. They believed certain findings would later become some of the most heavily debated aspects of the entire case. Prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated planning, opportunity, and involvement. The defense challenged those conclusions, arguing that investigators were interpreting evidence in a way that unfairly pointed towards Sarah. Like many high profile cases, the trial would ultimately become a battle between competing narratives. When the case finally reached court, public interest intensified dramatically. People throughout Idaho followed every development. The trial attracted attention because it combined several elements that often capture public fascination: family conflict, teenage defendants, allegations of betrayal, and the murder of parents. Jurors were presented with evidence intended to establish not only what happened, but also the events leading up to it. Prosecutors carefully laid out their theory, arguing that Sarah had both motive and opportunity. They described growing tensions within the household and presented evidence they believed connected her directly to the crime. The defense responded by attacking weaknesses in the prosecution's case and questioning whether investigators had overlooked alternative possibilities. Throughout the proceedings, jurors heard testimony from witnesses, experts, and individuals familiar with the family. Some testimony focused on relationships and household dynamics. Other testimony focused on physical evidence. Piece by piece, the prosecution attempted to build a narrative that explained how the murders occurred and why Sarah was responsible. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt by challenging those conclusions and highlighting areas where the evidence could be interpreted differently. For jurors, the responsibility was enormous. The case involved not only the deaths of two people, but also the future of a teenager accused of committing one of the most serious crimes imaginable. As testimony continued, the courtroom became the center of debate that extended far beyond legal arguments. People throughout the community were asking the same question: could Sarah Johnson really have done this? By the time both sides finished presenting their cases, it was clear that the verdict would have a profound impact not only on those directly involved, but also on a community that had spent years trying to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Yet the most dramatic chapter of the story was still ahead. Because once the jury reached its decision, the case would leave behind questions and controversies that continued long after the trial ended, ensuring that the Sarah Johnson case remained one of the most discussed criminal investigations in Idaho history. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, both sides understood that the jury's decision would ultimately depend on how they interpreted the evidence presented over weeks of testimony. Prosecutors argued that the case was straightforward. They believed the combination of motive, opportunity, witness testimony, and forensic evidence pointed clearly towards Sarah Johnson. According to their theory, the murders were not the result of a random intruder entering the home. They were the result of a deeply personal conflict that had reached a devastating conclusion. The defense, however, continued challenging that narrative. They argued that investigators had become focused on Sarah early in the investigation and interpreted evidence through that lens. They questioned whether alternative possibilities had been explored thoroughly enough and emphasized the seriousness of consequences of convicting someone based on circumstantial evidence. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Everyone involved understood the significance of what was about to happen. Jurors had spent weeks listening to testimony, reviewing evidence, and hearing complex explanations of the same events. Now they had to determine which version they believed. For the prosecution, the case centered on a simple argument. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly towards Sarah's guilt. For the defense, the case centered on uncertainty. They reminded jurors that suspicion is not proof and that criminal convictions require certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. Once deliberations began, attention shifted entirely to the jury. The community waited. Family members waited. Investigators waited. Cases involving the deaths of parents and allegations against their own children naturally generate intense emotions. But jurors were instructed to focus only on the evidence and law. Their responsibility was not to speculate. Their responsibility was to determine whether the prosecution had met its burden. Eventually, the jury reached a verdict. Sarah Johnson was found guilty of murdering her parents. The decision marked the end of one phase of the case, but the beginning of another. For investigators, the verdict validated years of work spent reconstructing the crime and building the prosecution's case. Detectives believed they had identified the person responsible and successfully presented the evidence supporting that conclusion. For supporters of Sarah, however, the verdict did not end in debate. Some continued questioning aspects of the investigation and arguing that important questions remained unanswered. This division is one of the reasons the case continued attracting attention long after the trial ended. Unlike cases where overwhelming evidence immediately convinces the public, the Sarah Johnson case remained the subject of discussion and disagreement. Following the conviction, Sarah received a sentence that ensured she would spend many years behind bars. The legal proceedings had concluded, but the broader impact of the case continued. For the Bellevue community, the murders represented one of the most shocking events in local history. Communities often struggle to process crimes that occur within families because they challenge assumptions about safety and trust. People expect danger to come from strangers. Cases like this force them to confront the reality that some of the most devastating crimes occur between people who know each other intimately. As years passed, the case became a subject of documentaries, articles, interviews, and ongoing interest. Many people remained fascinated by the questions of motive. What could drive a teenager to such an extreme act? Were the family conflicts truly severe enough to explain what happened? Did investigators uncover the entire truth, Or were there aspects of the story that would never be fully understood? These questions helped keep the case alive in public discussions long after the courtroom proceedings ended. Perhaps that's why the Sarah Johnson case continues to be remembered. It isn't simply a story about double homicide. It's a story about family relationships, conflict, teenage decision making, and the devastating consequences that can follow when tensions escalate beyond control. The case reminds investigators and communities alike that the most shocking crimes are often the ones that emerge from situations people thought they understood. From the outside, the Johnson family appeared ordinary. Yet behind that appearance, investigators believed a tragedy was developing that would eventually lead to people dead and a community searching for answers. And while the legal system ultimately reached a conclusion, the emotional questions surrounding the case never disappeared completely. The story remains one of the most well known criminal cases in Idaho history because it forces people to confront uncomfortable realities about family, trust, and the hidden struggles that can exist behind even the most ordinary looking lives. And while this case centered on a family tragedy that shocked a small community, the next story would involve a disappearance that would capture national attention, generate countless theories, and leave investigators chasing answers for years as they tried to solve a mystery that seemed to grow more complicated with every new discovery. The Sarah Johnson case was shocking because investigators believed the danger came from within the family itself. The next case, however, would begin with something entirely different. No crime scenes, no obvious suspect, no immediate answers. Instead, it started with a young woman who simply vanished. At first, people assumed she would be found quickly. Missing person reports are filled every day, and many of them are resolved within hours or days. Someone gets lost, leaves unexpectedly, or fails to contact family before eventually reappearing. But every so often, a disappearance takes a turn that nobody expects. The person doesn't come back. Leads dry up, witnesses disagree, and the more investigators learn, the less certain they become about what actually happened. That's exactly what occurred in the case of Tia Wimberly. Long before her name appeared in news reports, Tia was known simply as a young woman with plans, responsibilities, and people who cared about her. Friends described her as someone with goals for the future. Family members expected to continue seeing her build her life. There was nothing about her daily routine suggesting that she was about to become the center of a major investigation. Yet, one of the most frustrating realities of missing person cases is that life often appears completely normal right before everything changes. There is rarely a dramatic warning, rarely a clear sign. Sometimes a person simply disappears, leaving investigators to reconstruct their final days from scattered clues and incomplete information. When Tia was first reported missing, concern spread quickly among the people who knew her. Family members recognized that something was wrong. They expected to hear from her. They expected her to maintain contact. When that didn't happen, alarm bells started going off. Missing person investigations often begin with a simple question. Is the person's behavior unusual? Adults are generally free to go where they want. They can travel. They can leave town. They can decide not to contact certain people. Investigators therefore need evidence that a disappearance is genuinely out of character before treating it as suspicion. In Tia's case, the people closest to her believed exactly that. They insisted her silence was unusual. The more time passed, the more convinced they became that something had happened. Authorities began piecing together her last known movements. They reviewed phone records, interviewed friends, examined locations she had visited, and tried to establish a local timeline. At first, the investigation followed familiar patterns. Detectives searched for evidence that might indicate where she went or who she was with. Yet, almost immediately, they encountered a problem that would define the case. Information was fragmented. Some leads pointed in one direction, others pointed somewhere completely different. Witnesses provided pieces of the puzzle, but no single person seemed to possess the complete picture. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Tia's final days involved interactions with multiple people who would eventually become important to the investigation. Some were friends, some were acquaintances, some possessed information that investigators believed could help explain her disappearance. Yet sorting through those relationships proved difficult. Missing person investigations often involve enormous amounts of speculation. Rumors spread quickly. People misremember events. Stories change over time. Detectives needed facts, not assumptions. They spent countless hours verifying statements, comparing timelines, and determining which information could be trusted. Meanwhile, public concern continued to grow. Family members pushed for answers. Community members shared information. The search expanded. Yet, despite those efforts, investigators still could not answer the most important question: where was Tia? As days became weeks, concern gradually shifted into fear. Experienced investigators know that the first days of a disappearance are often critical. The longer a person remains missing, the more difficult it becomes to determine exactly what happened. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. Potential witnesses become harder to locate. Detectives understood that time was working against them. That's why they intensified their efforts, exploring every possible lead. Then the investigation became uncovering information that suggested the case might be more complicated than a simple disappearance. Certain statements raised concerns. Certain timelines appeared questionable. Some individuals connected to the case seemed unable to fully explain key details. Detectives found themselves looking beyond the possibility of a voluntary disappearance and considering something far more troubling. The more evidence they gathered, the more they began suspecting that Tia had not simply vanished on her own. If that suspicion was correct, then somewhere within the growing collection of interviews, phone records, and witness statements was the key to solving the mystery. The challenge was finding it before the trial went cold. And as investigators pushed deeper into Tia Wimberly's final known days, they were about to uncover information that would dramatically change the direction of the case and bring them closer to a truth far darker than anyone initially imagined. As investigators continued examining Tia Wimberly's disappearance, the case gradually shifted from a missing person investigation into something much more serious. During the earliest days, detectives still hoped they were dealing with a situation that might have an innocent explanation. People disappear temporarily for many reasons. Sometimes they leave voluntarily. Sometimes misunderstandings create unnecessary panic. Investigators are trained not to jump to conclusions, but as more information came in, that optimism began fading. The problem wasn't simply that Tia remained missing. The problem was that the evidence investigators were collecting wasn't pointing toward a voluntary disappearance. Instead, it was creating a picture that raised increasingly disturbing questions. Detectives spent countless hours reconstructing Tia's final known movements. They reviewed phone activity, spoke with everyone who had recently interacted with her, and carefully analyzed the timeline leading up to her disappearance. As they did so, they began focusing heavily on the people who were among the last known individuals to have contact with her. In many missing person cases, the most important information comes from the final hours before someone vanishes. Detectives wanted to know who saw Tia, what was discussed, where she planned to go, and whether anything unusual occurred. What they found was a collection of statements that did not always fit together neatly. Certain individuals offered explanations that investigators felt needed further scrutiny. Some details seemed incomplete. Other details appeared inconsistent. Experienced detectives know that inconsistencies do not automatically indicate guilt. People misremember events all the time. However, when a missing person case begins generating multiple contradictions, investigators pay attention. The more they dug, the more they believed someone knew more than they were saying. Meanwhile, Tia's family continued pushing for answers. As days turned into weeks, their frustration grew. They wanted progress. They wanted information. Most of all, they wanted Tia found. Families often become some of the strongest advocates in missing person investigations because they refuse to let cases disappear from public attention. That determination kept pressure on investigators and ensured that the search remained active even as leads became more difficult to develop. Detectives continued reviewing every piece of evidence available to them. Phone records became particularly important. Modern investigations often rely heavily on digital evidence because phones can reveal movements, communications, and relationships that might otherwise remain hidden. During the period leading up to her disappearance, they compared those records against witness statements and timelines. As they did so, certain individuals began attracting more attention than others. Authorities became increasingly interested in understanding exactly what happened during Tia's final known interactions. The challenge was that nobody seemed to be able to provide a complete explanation. Instead, detectives were forced to piece together fragments from multiple sources. One witness remembered one detail, another remembered something different. Each piece added to the puzzle, but the overall picture remained frustratingly incomplete. The investigators encountered another problem, common in major cases: rumors. As public interest grew, speculation spread rapidly. People offered theories, stories circulated. Some information turned out to be useful, much of it did not. Detectives had to separate facts from assumptions while continuing to pursue legitimate leads. This consumed enormous amounts of time and resources. Yet, despite those difficulties, the investigation continued moving forward. Gradually, authorities began developing a clearer understanding of the relationship surrounding Tia during the period before she disappeared. Those relationships became central to the case because investigators believed they could explain what happened. People rarely vanish without some connection to their final known circumstances. Whether through friendships, conflicts, opportunity, or coincidence, the answers often lie within victims' immediate social circles. Detectives believed the principle applied here as well. As pressure mounted, investigators intensified interviews with individuals connected to the case. Some interviews lasted hours, others were repeated multiple times. Detectives compared statements against evidence and looked for discrepancies. Every inconsistency generated new questions. Every new question led to further investigation. Slowly but surely, authorities began narrowing their focus. By now, many investigators no longer believed they were searching for a missing person who would simply reappear. Instead, they feared they were investigating a crime. The realization changed the entire strategy of the case. Resources shifted, priorities changed. Detectives began searching not just for Tia, but for evidence explaining what may have happened to her. Yet, despite all of their efforts, one critical piece remained missing. They still did not know exactly where Tia was. Without that answer, proving what happened would be extremely difficult. Nevertheless, investigators believed they were getting closer. The inconsistencies they had identified were becoming harder to ignore. The timelines were becoming clearer. The list of possible explanations was shrinking. Somewhere within the evidence, detectives believed was the truth. And as they continued digging deeper into the final days before Tia's disappearance, they were about to uncover developments that would transform the investigation completely and bring them closer than ever to solving the mystery. As the investigation moved deeper into what authorities now believed was a criminal case, detectives found themselves closer to the truth than ever before. The challenge was that they still lacked one crucial element that often transforms suspicion into certainty. They had inconsistencies. They had people whose stories didn't fully align with the evidence. They had timelines that raised serious concerns. But they still needed the piece that would allow them to explain exactly what happened to Tia Wimberly. Investigators understood that many major cases reach this stage. Detectives became convinced they're moving in the right direction, yet they still needed enough evidence to prove it. That's why the next phase of the investigation became so important. Authorities began re-examining every lead they had collected since the day Tia disappeared. Nothing was considered too small. Every phone call, every text message, every witness statement, and every reported sighting was reviewed again. Sometimes breakthroughs occur not because new evidence appears, but because investigators see old evidence in a new way. That was exactly what detectives hoped would happen here. As they continued interviewing people connected to the case, pressure began mounting. Individuals who may have felt comfortable during the early days of the investigation were now facing much more detailed questions. Detectives had spent weeks learning the case. They knew the timelines. They knew the inconsistencies. They knew which statements conflicted with other evidence. That knowledge allowed them to challenge explanations that previously went unexamined. In many criminal investigations, the truth begins emerging when people realize investigators already know more than they initially believed. Authorities suspected the dynamic was beginning to develop. At the same time, the search for physical evidence intensified. Detectives knew that witness testimonies can be powerful. but physical evidence often provides the strongest support for a case. They examined locations connected to the investigation, searched areas of interest, and continued pursuing any lead that might reveal what happened during Tia's final known hours. Every discovery mattered, because the case had now reached a critical point. Investigators no longer believed they were simply trying to locate a missing woman. They believed they were trying to reconstruct a crime. The emotional impact on Tia's family remained enormous through this period. While investigators focused on evidence, her loved ones faced the uncertainty that defines so many missing person cases. Every day without answers created new questions. Every week that passed made the situation more difficult. Families often describe uncertainty as one of the hardest parts of a disappearance because there is no clear ending. Hope and fear exist at the same time. People desperately want answers, even when they fear those answers may be painful. Detectives understood this reality and continued working toward a resolution. Gradually, investigators began developing a theory of what they believed had occurred. According to that theory, the disappearance was not random. It was not an accident, and it was not a voluntary decision to leave her life behind. Instead, authorities believed events involving people within Tia's circle ultimately led to her disappearance. The exact details were pieced together through countless interviews, records, and investigative efforts. By now, detectives believed they understood much more about the circumstances surrounding her final days than they had during the chaotic early stages of the case. Yet proving that theory remained difficult. Missing person investigations often present unique challenges because crucial evidence may never be recovered. Prosecutors and investigators must sometimes build cases through a combination of circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral patterns. That process can take years. In Tia's case, authorities remained committed to finding the answers they believed were hidden somewhere within the evidence. As the investigation continued, significant developments eventually began moving the case closer to resolution. New information emerged. Leads that once seemed uncertain became clearer. Individuals connected to the case found themselves under increasing scrutiny. Slowly, the picture that used to be incomplete for so long began coming into focus. For detectives, it was the result of persistence. For Tia's family, it represented the possibility that they might finally learn about what happened. The case that began as a disappearance had evolved into a much larger search for truth and accountability. And as investigators moved toward the final stage of the investigation, they were preparing to confront the individuals they believed possessed the answers they had been seeking from the very beginning. What happened next would determine whether the mystery surrounding Tia Wimberly could finally be solved, or whether it would remain another unanswered case that lingered for years. Fortunately for investigators, the evidence they had spent so long assembling was about to produce the breakthrough they had been waiting for, bringing the story closer to its conclusion and revealing a reality far more tragic than anyone hoped the search would first begin. As investigators pushed toward the final stage of the case, the mystery had surrounded Tia Wimberly's disappearance for so long was finally beginning to unravel. The process was not dramatic or instantaneous. There was no single moment where every question suddenly received an answer. Instead, the truth emerged the same way many complex investigations are solved, through persistence, patience, and countless hours spent connecting pieces of evidence that initially seemed unrelated. By this point, detectives had spent months analyzing timelines, reviewing statements, examining digital records, and comparing every known fact surrounding Tia's final days. What once appeared to be a confusing disappearance now looked like a different way through the eyes of investigators. Authorities no longer viewed the case as a mystery involving a missing person who might have voluntarily returned. They believed they were dealing with a crime, and more importantly, they believed they had identified the individuals connected to it. As pressure increased, the inconsistencies that detectives had noticed from the beginning became increasingly important. Statements that once seemed believable no longer matched the evidence. Certain explanations became harder to defend as investigators accumulated more information. Detectives often describe these moments as the point where a case begins tightening around the truth. The evidence starts forming a narrative that becomes difficult to ignore. Every interview, every record, and every timeline begins pointing in the same direction. That's what investigators believed was happening here. Eventually, authorities concluded that Tia had not simply vanished. They believed her disappearance resulted from actions taken by people who knew her, people who possessed information that investigators spent months trying to uncover. For Tia's family, this realization was devastating. Families of missing persons often spend years holding on to hope. Even when evidence suggests something terrible has happened, hope remains difficult to abandon completely. Accepting that a loved one will never simply walk back through the door is one of the most painful realities imaginable. Yet, as investigators presented their findings, it became increasingly clear that the outcome they feared most was likely the truth. The case became a reminder of one of the harsh realities investigators face. Sometimes solving a mystery does not bring happiness. Sometimes it simply brings answers. Those answers can provide accountability. They can provide understanding. But they cannot undo what happened. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained focused on one goal: finding the truth. By the end of those cases, they believed they had accomplished that goal. The road to reaching that point had been long and frustrating. Leads had failed. Witnesses had provided conflicting information. Rumors had complicated the search for facts. Yet, despite those obstacles, investigators continued pushing forward until they could explain what they believed happened during the final chapter of Tia's life. For the community, the case left a lasting impact. Stories involving disappearances often resonate deeply because they touch on universal fears. The idea that someone can suddenly vanish without explanation is unsettling in a way few other crimes are. People imagine themselves, their friends, or their family members in the same situation. That's one reason missing person cases attract so much attention. They force people to confront uncertainty, vulnerability, and the reality that answers do not always come quickly. Tia Wimberly's story became one of those cases that people remembered long after the headlines faded, not because of a dramatic courtroom spectacle or an international manhunt, but because of the determination required to uncover the truth. Investigators refused to let go of the case. Family members refused to stop asking questions. And together, those efforts ensured that Tia would not simply become another forgotten name in a database of unsolved disappearances. In the end, the case served as both a tragedy and a lesson. It demonstrated how difficult missing person investigations can be, how important persistence is, and how critical it is for investigators to keep pursuing answers even when progress seems impossible. While no outcome could erase the pain experienced by those who loved Tia, the investigation ultimately provided something they had spent so long seeking: an understanding what happened and a measure of accountability for those responsible. And while this story began with a disappearance and ended with the investigators uncovering the truth piece by piece, the next case would be different from the very start. There would be no long search for a missing person and no years of uncertainty about what had occurred. Instead, the next story would begin with a crime so shocking and unexpected that an entire community would be left asking the same question: how could someone so young become responsible for something so devastating?